The Virginia Roadside Marker Program began under Governor Harry F. Byrd in 1926. Headed by Irish immigrant William Carson, the program was part of a larger effort conceived by Byrd to boost Virginia's economy. The idea was to capitalize on the growing popularity of cars. More cars, plus a tax on gas, meant more money for travel. More travel paved the way for road improvements. After a few years wrangling with the Virginia Assembly, Byrd and his supporters succeeded. History became the lure to Virginia's emerging tourism-based economy. But while the program was a great idea, it was born of the time and the men who created it, and both held deeply racist sentiments. The 1920s and 1930s were a reactionary period during which whites, notably those with power, were fighting the slow but steady progress made by black men, recently enfranchised white women, and the rise of activist groups like the NAACP. The first 700 markers were created by a small team of state-employed historians whose focus was mostly on the Revolutionary leaders and the Civil War. Jennifer Liu, the current manager of Virginia's Highway Marker Program, stated, "The markers were definitely, quote, oriented towards the great white man style of history that was very popular back then." Big changes came in 1976 when Virginia altered the program's funding structure. The state was no longer willing to foot the bill for the markers, and there would be an application. While the loss of financial support was disappointing, the rest probably wasn't. Essentially, the program was freed from the state historians' preferences as to what deserved a marker. This enabled communities, historic groups, and even individuals across the state to apply. If their application was accepted, they could pay for the marker, but the state would pay for the installation, and it would pay for certain types of upkeep. Groups throughout the state, notably those of marginalized communities, took advantage of these changes. Today, there are 2,500 roadside markers across the state of Virginia. What is a color line? In the U.S., a color line is a demarcation in built landscapes that determines who lives where, or really, who can live where. Some culturally and racially cohesive neighborhoods initially grew organically as migrants created new communities for themselves in unfamiliar spaces. In early 20th century U.S., the Great Migration, the continued expansion of industrialism, and other international forces were pushing peoples of different color and cultures into closer proximity. But the larger white culture didn't want to accept or acknowledge the worthiness of these new communities, so they slowly developed ways to separate themselves. These broad efforts became known as redlining, the practice of marking real estate maps with red lines, denoting black, brown, and immigrant neighborhoods. Early 20th century real estate practices, HOAs, banking systems, school construction, and busing systems were all used to isolate and denigrate these neighborhoods, cutting them off with highways, neglecting access to mass transit and healthcare systems, and often devoiding them of green space. The most infamous red line districts scarred the landscape and even today are visually identifiable, even to those who are unfamiliar with redlining. But what about those older spaces lacking obvious hallmarks? Spaces lined with picket fences and green grass, well-trimmed lawns, fantastic proximity to resources? In these places, the harm caused is easier to miss, making it also harder to acknowledge. In places like my small town, the color line has slowly faded from notice as the town has grown up around it. But it is visible on local history maps and in the memories of the residents whose families built homes and lived in the neighborhood. And its location was centuries in the making. Before colonial settlers arrived, the Manahoac, Hoac, and Piscataway made what is known as Perceville part of their homelands. Long traveled routes still used today cross the area, connecting communities and people throughout the eastern seaboard. For the colonial settlers, the area was part of the inconceivably large Fairfax Grant that opened to grantees in the 1740s. This happened after colonists, including George Washington and others from notable white Virginia families, forcibly pressed their way into what is today West Virginia, southwestern Pennsylvania, and eastern Ohio. Assuming it was now safe to travel and settle in these southwestern regions, Quakers from north of Philadelphia followed the ancient routes, surveyed land, and were granted large tracts. They were quickly followed by extended family and neighbors who made up a southbound diaspora, some of whom settled in the Purcellville region while others continued southward. The important takeaways here are land ownership and the Society of Friends. Northwestern Loudoun County was home to many religious communities, but the Friends were one of the largest. Most Quakers were pacifists who disagreed or openly opposed enslavement, and it was a Quaker family by the name of Birdsall that sold the tracts of land in Purcellville on which many black families purchased and built their homes. That's important because not every Purcellville landowner was willing to sell to black buyers. Several years ago, local historians found a restrictive covenant in a deed search that barred the sale of plots of land to African Americans. The deed states that if the inheritor were ever to sell the plots to anyone who was African American, then the properties would automatically revert to other family members. This would have been about the mid 20th century. While this property isn't on the actual color line, it is on the eastern border of the neighborhood, and it does help define the neighborhood even as it exists today. Racism designated space, and it created unwelcome for African Americans in white business areas. Older African American community members recall being barred from in-town eateries, barbershops, and the like. But those weren't the only options. Purcellville's African American neighborhood was connected to the greater region through community and family ties. Between and within each community, members created spaces of support and economy. Living rooms, porches, front steps, the segregated school, the segregated meeting space, all these places sprung up in Purcellville within this neighborhood. And they became places where you could get a hairdo or buy an ice cream. You could possibly rub elbows with a famous choreographer. Definitely the famous seamstress and tailor lived just down the street. So it was a really tight-knit community with a deep sense of social activism. Putting the sign on Purcellville's color line doesn't just acknowledge the past deeds. It does do that hard work. But more importantly, it acknowledges and elevates the successes of the members of the community, their hard work, their sense of social activism, and everything that they put in to building up Purcellville despite the barriers that they encountered.